future historians may come to regard 2022 as a hinge in history, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. Major war returned to Europe, with the attendant threats of nuclear strikes, and the door closed firmly shut on the U.S. policy of strategic engagement with China. Yes, the past 12 months did bring some good news. Most notably, the COVID-19 pandemic eased in many countries. But overall, 2022 brought more bad news than good news. War in Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin launches the biggest invasion in Europe since World War II when he sends troops into Ukraine on February 24, causing millions of Ukrainians to flee abroad. The West imposes unprecedented sanctions on Moscow and sends billions of dollars in aid to Ukraine. Russian forces failed to capture Kiev and topple the government of President Volodymyr Zelensky. In the south, Russian forces capture most of Ukraine's Black Sea coastline, including the port of Mariupol. Pakistan's Imran Khan stepped down as prime minister in April after losing in a standoff with parliament. Then Sri Lankan President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, meanwhile, was forced to flee his country after protesters stormed his official residence. In both cases, the two nations' crashing economies, double-digit inflation, mounting public debts, and food and fuel shortages, caused in part by the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine, but also by government's ineptitude, were the catalyst. In Iran, the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini following her arrest for alleged violations of the country's Islamic dress code sparks the biggest protests in years. On the street and on social media, women and girls defiantly remove their headscarves in an unprecedented challenge to the country's clerical leadership. Iran seeks to quell the protests by sentencing some of the protesters to death. The Oslo-based Monitor Iran Human Rights on December 19 says Iran's security forces have killed at least 469 people in the protests while at least 14,000 people have been arrested, according to the UN. The great power competition between China and the United States is fully underway. The Joe Biden administration's National Security Strategy, released in October 2022, made the point bluntly. The administration pointed to Beijing's militarization of the South China Sea, its support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, its efforts to intimidate Taiwan, and its rampant theft of intellectual property as evidence that Beijing's behavior had forced the United States to abandon its policy of welcoming China's rise. With President Xi Jinping cementing his control in China after winning a historic third term in November, the tensions between the two great powers are likely to dominate world affairs in years to come. Britain gets its fifth Conservative Prime Minister in 6 years. Rishi Sunak takes office in October after his tax-cutting predecessor Liz Truss self-combusts in just 44 days, the shortest ever tenure for a British leader. Truss's lightning fall from grace, sparked by a disastrous mini-budget, caps a tumultuous 2022 in Britain. The year is marked by the death of its longest-serving monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, at the age of 96, and the forced resignation of Brexiteer Premier Boris Johnson after a series of scandals. Europe swelters through the hottest summer in its recorded history, with the mercury topping 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, for the first time in Britain. Parts of the Arctic and Antarctic, China and the US also experience record temperatures. Extreme weather events linked to climate change continue to wreak havoc in developing countries. Flooding in Pakistan affects vast swathes of the country. Nigeria suffers its worst floods in a decade, and parts of drought-hit Somalia face the threat of famine. At the United Nations Climate Summit in Egypt, COP27, developing nations finally succeed in getting wealthy polluters to agree to pay into a loss and damage fund to compensate poorer countries for climate damage.